England, 1816. There were men who feared war, men who feared scandal, and men who feared loneliness. But Archibald Whitstone, 9th Duke of Whitstone, feared disturbance. For as long as memory allowed, he lived by a single unwavering belief. Contentment is a fragile thing. Once disturbed, it seldom returns. It shaped everything, his routines, his relationships, his staunch refusal to let the world too close. To his tenants, he was reliable. To society, enviable. To himself, impenetrably calm. Or so he liked to pretend. The morning his carriage rolled back onto Whitstone lands after 6 disciplined months abroad, the estate air smelled of spring hyacinths, wet soil, and chimney smoke. But peace, his most coveted possession, did not greet him at the door. A butler did. And in his gloved hand, a thick envelope bearing the Dowager Duchess's unmistakable looping script. Archibald took it with a heaviness that belonged more to fate than paper. He broke the seal with a thumb, exhaled as though pre-mourning whatever inconvenience awaited him, and read, Whitstone House, the 14th of April, 1816. My dearest Archibald, I trust your 6-month inspection abroad has not entirely frozen your disposition. I imagine you are returning with your usual solemnity, convinced that a quiet life is a safe life. But my dear boy, safety has never brought a family into being. I write with excellent news. I have taken it upon myself, out of love, of course, to arrange a modest gathering at Whitstone House upon your return. Nothing ostentatious, merely a 5-night ball to reintroduce you properly to society. Before you roll your eyes. Yes, Archibald, I am perfectly aware you dislike such events. And yes, I know you find smiling to be a dreadful misuse of facial muscles. But smile you must. I expect you to be gracious, attentive, and, dare I say, pleasant. There will be many accomplished young ladies in attendance. You need not marry one of them. You need only notice them. Furthermore, I've instructed Mrs. Halpert to ensure all preparations are completed before your arrival. The staff will handle the details. You must only appear, look handsome, and behave as though I have raised you well. I shall be away for a short while longer, business of my own, but trust that all will be perfectly arranged when you arrive. Be kind, be present, and Archibald, try to smile. Your loving mother, Eleanor, Dowager Duchess of Whitstone. When he finished, Archibald closed his eyes briefly, jaw tightening as though bracing against an oncoming storm. 5 nights. 5 nights of chatter, flirtation, polite interrogation. 5 nights of his mother's meddling wrapped in the silk of maternal affection. He folded the letter with the precision of a man folding away his patience. Peace, he murmured to no one, was pleasant while it lasted. Yet miles away, beyond Whitstone lands, beyond the rigid order he clung to, another life was shifting quietly toward his. Margot Kempshott stood in her father's gardens, wrist-deep in warm earth. The house of Kempshott, just outside Bath, shone beneath the afternoon sun, its white porticos framed by climbing roses. It was a world of elegance, yes, but not one that suited her spirit. At 28, Margot was already deemed a spinster. Too particular, too dreamy, too unwilling to marry a man she did not love. Your head is forever in the clouds, her aunt often scolded. Real life is not a fairy tale. But Margot had never chased rescue, only choice. She wanted to be chosen wholly, deeply, without pretense. And so she carved out small rebellions in her everyday life, working in the gardens, helping tenants sort accounts, learning tasks meant for servants, not daughters of earls. Independence steadied her more than any ballroom admiration ever had, which was precisely why she stood before her father that afternoon with a practiced, harmless lie. I shall visit Cousin Harriet for a short while, she said lightly. She needs assistance with her conservatory. Her father, Earl Kempshott, smiled indulgently. A change of scenery will do you good, my dear. But Margot was not going to Harriet. She had already accepted a temporary position at Whitstone House, a servant for 5 nights only, assisting with the Duke's grand event. 5 nights to disappear from expectations. 5 nights to feel purposeful. 5 nights to live by her own quiet rebellion, completely unaware that her path would cross with a man who believed love was the most dangerous disturbance of all, and wholly unaware that the Dowager Duchess of Whitstone, who claimed to be abroad, was already planning her return to England in a disguise bold enough to upend her son's peaceful world. A disguise that would place her directly in Margot Kempshot's path. The servants' passage of Whitstone House always smelled faintly of coal dust and lavender soap. Margot noticed it before she noticed the woman. She had risen before the kitchen fires were fully stoked, seeking the quiet hours before the rest of the household stirred. The corridor lamps still glowed in their sconces, trembling in the draught as she turned toward the east wing. And there, half kneeling, half balancing, was the newest addition to the staff. The woman was on the floor with a damp cloth in hand, attempting to polish the aged wood. But everything about her posture was wrong. Her back was too straight for kneeling, her movements too delicate, and her gloves of all ridiculous things, clung to her fingers as though she had never scrubbed anything in her life. She looked like a duchess forced to reenact a servant's chore. Margot knew that look. She recognized the silent desperation of someone acting a part. "Good morning," Margot murmured, approaching softly. The woman started, head lifting sharply. Beneath the plain maid's cap, her face was dignified, composed, far too regal for the corridor she occupied. Her blue eyes carried intelligence, not servitude. "My apologies," the woman said softly. "I was told this section required polishing." Margot knelt beside her, gently relieving her of the cloth. The woman's hand felt unnaturally smooth against the rough linen cloth. It was the hand of a lady, not a worker. Margot didn't need a name to know they were both lying about who they were. "Press firmly," Margot explained, demonstrating with practiced ease. "Follow the grain of the wood. Light strokes only smear the polish." The woman watched carefully, almost hungrily, repeating the motion with slow, unnatural determination. "You are patient with me," she murmured. "I fear I am not suited to this occupation." "Most new maids struggle," Margot replied, allowing her smile to warm. "You will manage. What do the other maids call you?" The woman hesitated for only a fraction of a second, her elegant composure holding firm. "Davies," she said. "Mrs. Davies." Margot returned the simple nod. "It is good to meet you, Mrs. Davies. I'm simply called Kempshot." They continued working in companionable silence, Margot taking the lead, Davies following awkwardly. This simple, shared purpose, dusting away the expectations of society, was a quiet comfort Margot had not expected to find here. She felt a connection, a shared history of knowing what it meant to be observed and judged. Meanwhile, in his private study, Archibald was already folding the latest invitation addressed to his mother, the Dowager Duchess. He had instructed his staff to intercept all correspondence and ensure his peace was undisturbed. He hated the balls, he hated the forced conversation, but mostly he hated the creeping sense that his mother had successfully backed him into a corner from which there was no honorable escape. He stood up, pulling his waistcoat tight. He was a duke. He controlled his world. He would endure 5 nights, find a way to politely dismiss the procession of hopefuls, and return to his beloved solitude. He told himself this until it sounded almost true. He would not allow his life to be disturbed by something as chaotic as emotion. He was a man who planned for every eventuality, yet he had no plan for the unexpected intrusion of a stubborn heart. Later that evening, the ballroom began to fill. Chandeliers dripped with light, and the air was thick with perfume, expectation, and the faint, sweet sound of the string quartet. Eleanor, Mrs. Davies, was stationed near the French doors, collecting discarded serving platters. The uniform chafed, but the obscurity was priceless. She could watch. She could assess. Her eyes settled instantly on Miss Evelyn Ashcombe. The girl was stunning, a sleek black dress, pearls, and a smile aimed at Archibald with the precision of a practiced huntress. Evelyn stood too close to the Duke, laughed too loudly at his polite, neutral replies, and clearly saw herself as the inevitable next Duchess. Archibald, however, looked like a statue carved from duty. He was gracious, yes, but detached. He didn't want her. Evelyn was wasting her time. When Evelyn finally failed to elicit a genuine spark from the Duke and retreated to a quiet corner near the refreshments table, Eleanor saw her chance. She approached Evelyn with a tray, wiping it down slowly. "You have a lovely gown, my lady," Eleanor murmured, keeping her voice low and respectful, the voice of a senior servant who had seen it all. Evelyn, still fuming from the Duke's tepid attention, barely glanced at the maid. "Do your work, woman." Eleanor ignored the dismissal. "Forgive me, my lady, but I notice you are determined to catch the Duke's eye. A handsome, important man, yes, but one who is slow to notice. Why waste your beauty on a wall of stone?" Evelyn finally looked up, irritated by the interruption, but intrigued by the maid's boldness. "What do you mean, slow to notice, and why does a servant dare speak to me of my intentions?" Eleanor leaned in conspiratorially. "I apologize for the presumption, but you strike me as a fine-spirited lady, and I happen to know a fine-spirited gentleman who would appreciate that fire. My own son, you see. Not a duke, no, but a good man, handsome, honest, and steady. He earns near £500 a year as a solicitor in Bath. He would truly know how to make a woman like you his wife." The suggestion, the sheer audacity of a maid offering her son to a titled lady, snapped the tension in Evelyn like a breaking whip. Evelyn recoiled, her face twisting into a mask of pure aristocratic disgust. "I could never marry the son of a maid," Evelyn hissed, the contempt in her voice so sharp it sliced through the polite background chatter. "Imagine the humiliation." Eleanor's elegant, disguised composure cracked, not with pain, but with a fierce, quiet appraisal. She simply bowed her head and backed away. The mission completed. Eleanor walked away knowing one thing. Evelyn Ashcombe might wear a duchess's silks, but she possessed the common cruelty of a viper. She was not worthy of Archibald. She would not be his duchess. A moment later, Margot Kempshott, assigned to restock the lemon slices, entered the quiet corridor. She had witnessed the exchange, the maid's careful offer, the lady's crushing, brutal rejection. The humiliation burned beneath Margot's ribs. This was the world she had run from, a world where kindness was measured by title. She quickly set down her tray. "That was uncalled for, Miss Ashcombe," Margot said, stepping forward. Evelyn blinked, surprised she had been challenged by another servant. "What did you say?" Margot stepped closer, calm but fierce. "No one deserves to be spoken to that way. If kindness is beneath you, perhaps humility should not be." Evelyn flushed hotly, enraged that a servant would dare correct her. "You presume too much." Margot met her gaze steadily. "And you presume the world should bend simply because you wish to impress a certain gentleman who has yet to notice you?" Evelyn's lips parted in outrage. "Careful," she hissed. "You are replaceable." Margot smiled softly, a challenging, fearless smile. So are cruel people. The corridor froze. The Dowager, Mrs. Davies, stared at Margot, not with shock, but with the quiet recognition of a strength she desperately needed in her son's life. Little did Eleanor know that this girl, this self-proclaimed servant who spoke with the bravery of an earl's daughter, was not only the fate of her son, but the only person who would stand up for her dignity. Little did Margot know that she had not just defended a simple maid, but the mother of the man she was falling toward, the man whose peace she was about to utterly destroy. The second night of the Whitstone ball offered no refuge, it only offered noise. Archibald stood near the massive stone fireplace, enduring the polite, polished scrutiny of the ton. The air was thick and cloying. Too many people, too many perfumes, too many women vying for a future he did not want. He found himself scanning the room not for prospects, but for Mrs. Halpert, the housekeeper, needing assurance that the staff was managing the chaos. He caught sight of Miss Evelyn Ashcombe, again dressed in dazzling emerald silk, making an obvious, calculated approach. He braced himself, jaw tight. Contentment is a fragile thing, and this, whatever this was the opposite of contentment. Across the room, near the long table piled with frosted cakes and delicate crystal glasses, Margot was meticulously arranging the champagne flutes. The work was endless, exhausting, and completely exhilarating. She was a different person here, unlabeled, unburdened by the expectation of an earl's daughter. She was simply Kempshot, a woman with purpose. She caught the eye of Mrs. Davies, the older maid, who was collecting soiled napkins. Mrs. Davies offered a discreet, knowing smile, a silent message of, "We are in this together." That simple bond, forged in the heat of the back corridors, felt truer than any social allegiance Margot had ever known. This was the moment. Evelyn, having received another neutral, non-committal reply from the Duke, was already in a simmering fury. She was elegant, yes, but her entitlement was an ugly thing that frayed her composure like cheap lace. She spotted Mrs. Davies hovering near the table. Evelyn sauntered over, pausing dramatically near the edge of the table where Mrs. Davies was reaching for a cluster of abandoned glassware. Evelyn did not need to speak. The disdain in her posture alone was a weapon. "You know, I find this new arrangement quite bothersome," Evelyn said, her voice pitched just loud enough to carry over the music. "The servants are entirely too visible. It rather spoils the ambience." Mrs. Davies stiffened slightly, her hands pausing near the glasses. She simply kept her head down and murmured, "My apologies, my lady. We endeavor to be as quiet as possible." "Quiet is not enough," Evelyn replied, pulling a full glass of claret from a passing tray. She looked directly at Mrs. Davies's plain apron, the cloth that held the shame of the title line. And then, with a barely perceptible, cruel shift of her elbow, Evelyn lurched. The heavy, dark red wine flew from the glass, splattering across the front of Mrs. Davies's cap and running down the starched white of her apron. "Oh, how terribly clumsy of me," Evelyn cooed, her eyes devoid of remorse, shining with malice. She dropped the empty glass carelessly onto the table. "Now look at that frightful mess. Quick, woman, clean it up, unless you intend to stain the entire evening." Mrs. Davies bit back a gasp. The silk beneath the apron felt instantly cold and sticky. She was the Dowager Duchess of Whitstone, and she was being forced to kneel to clean a stain her own guest had inflicted upon her. The pain was acute. Not the physical discomfort of the wine, but the searing humiliation of being reminded of her place. A reminder delivered by the very cruelty she had tested the night before. She grabbed a towel and sank down, attempting to scrub the expensive ballroom floor before the stain set. A wave of cold dread washed over her. This disguise. It had given her freedom, but it had stripped her of the authority she needed to protect her dignity. She had forgotten what it was like to be powerless. Margot, who was only a few feet away preparing a water pitcher, watched the entire scene unfold. The casual wickedness, the sheer unnecessary spite in Evelyn's eyes. It was the moment that snapped the last cord of her patience. Margot knew what it felt like to be judged and diminished. But to watch this kind, awkward older woman, this maid who was trying her best, being publicly abused was too much. The composure Margot had worked so hard to achieve shattered. She moved instantly. She did not approach as a servant. She approached as a furious woman protecting someone she cared for. "Miss Ashcombe." Margot's voice was low, cutting and startlingly clear, drawing a handful of nearby guests to attention. She didn't shout. She didn't beg. She simply commanded. Evelyn turned, finding herself confronted by another maid, this one with fire in her light eyes. "It was an accident," Evelyn stated, already defensive. "Mind your place." "Accidents happen in crowded rooms," Margot countered, stepping between Evelyn and the kneeling dowager. But cruelty requires intent, and if you are trying to impress the Duke with your sharp wit, I suggest you aim for cleverness, not simple malice. The sting of her words was undeniable. Evelyn's face went crimson. "You are insolent," Evelyn hissed. "I will see you dismissed from this house by morning." "You will do no such thing," Margot returned, her voice shaking slightly but her eyes steady. She planted herself firmly. "This woman is working, Miss Ashcombe. If you are incapable of walking 3 feet without causing a disaster, then you should remain seated. Leave her alone." "You," Evelyn stammered, raising her hand as though she might strike Margot. "You are the same one who spoke to me yesterday. You have forgotten that you are replaceable." Margot's chin lifted, radiating the courage of an earl's daughter, even in the plain grey dress. "Perhaps I am. But I would rather lose my place defending what is right than keep it by staying silent when I witness something so fundamentally wrong." Evelyn was speechless with rage. Her hand trembled, but she dropped it, unable to sustain the confrontation against Margot's sudden, quiet intensity. Just as the music lagged and a deep silence fell over the small cluster of onlookers, Mrs. Davies, still trying to clean the stain, shifted her position slightly. Her elbow knocked against the table leg. The resulting jolt caused her to lose balance entirely, and she tipped over, falling hard onto the polished wood floor. In the sudden commotion, the small plain lace cap that had concealed her identity for 2 days slipped forward and tumbled off her head. The hair that spilled onto the floor was not the dull brown of a common maid. It was thick, silver-shot chestnut hair, styled with the precision only a titled lady's maid could achieve, and unmistakable to every person in that house who had lived there for a decade. A collective gasp went through the guests. At that precise moment, Archibald, disturbed by the sudden shift in noise and needing to escape Evelyn, walked swiftly toward the commotion to restore order. He arrived just as the figure on the floor lifted her head. He saw the wine stain. He saw the fire in the eyes of the young, defiant maid standing over her, and then his gaze locked on the familiar, mortified face of the woman on the floor. Archibald Whitstone, 9th Duke of Whitstone, the man who feared disturbance above all else, froze. His voice was a raw, choked sound, betraying every ounce of his coveted composure. "Mother," he whispered, the single word cutting through the ballroom silence like breaking glass. What are you doing?" The world stopped. Evelyn, still flushed from her verbal loss to Margot, stared at the kneeling woman she had just humiliated and told, just 24 hours earlier, that she could never marry the son of a maid. Her face went from crimson to stark white. Margot stared at the woman she had affectionately called Mrs. Davies, realizing she had not defended a maid, but the Dowager Duchess of Whitstone. Her quiet rebellion had just exploded into an irreversible scandal. She had defended the Duchess from the Duke's intended bride, and she was only wearing a servant's apron. Archibald stood there, shattered, his gaze sweeping from his mother to the stain, and finally to the fierce, courageous maid who had dared to defend her. It was the most beautiful disruption he had ever witnessed, and in that frozen moment of chaos, he realized his life had just changed irrevocably. The night of the revelation, the Dowager's unmasking, was night 2 of the 5-night ball. The drama had now shifted the entire trajectory of the house. Archibald had sent his mother to her chambers, dismissing the shocked guests, including a hyperventilating Evelyn, with a single icy order for silence. The next 3 days were a blur of intense, constrained chaos. For the rest of the ball, Archibald felt like a man trapped inside a glass cage. His composure was gone, shattered by a single word: mother. The source of the destruction was now the source of his fascination. His fear of disturbance had vanished, replaced by an unsettling, potent curiosity. He no longer saw the maid. He saw Margot. He had learned her name from his mother, whispered in the cold, tense aftermath of the reveal. Margot Kempshott. She was now elevated in his mind, not by title, but by the fire he had seen in her eyes as she defended his mother. That defiance, that lack of self-preservation in the face of aristocracy, was the most disturbing and therefore the most captivating quality he had ever witnessed. He began to watch her, discreetly, obsessively. He would position himself near the library door, pretending to peruse a volume of poetry while his eyes tracked her movements across the ballroom floor. There she was, dusting a forgotten corner. There she was, handing a glass of lemonade to a tired footman. She did her job with a quiet competence, never seeking attention, never complaining. She moved with a dignity that eclipsed every young woman in silk and jewels who paraded before him. He had spent his life valuing quiet efficiency and predictability. But Margot was a beautiful anomaly, a profound, courageous spirit disguised as service. He watched her hands, the same hands that had wiped the wine from his mother's apron. They were strong hands, capable hands. He found himself imagining them elsewhere, feeling a profound internal shift he had never anticipated. He knew he should speak to her, offer her a better position, apologize. Yet the words froze in his throat. What could he possibly say to the woman who had seen his Duchess mother on her knees, humiliated by a girl he was supposed to marry? He was a duke, incapable of expressing a genuine emotion, and she was a maid who had just shown more bravery than his entire guest list combined. He felt a loneliness more profound than ever before. He had sought safety in solitude, but now he saw the true cost. He had alienated himself from the kind of vibrant, honest human connection Margot embodied. But this feeling of dread, he thought, was the pain of his old life finally giving way to something real. Margot spent the final days of the ball in a state of suspended terror. She was not fired. She was not arrested. She was simply ignored by the Dowager Duchess, now back in her proper silks, though confining herself to her rooms, and intensely watched by the Duke. His gaze was heavy. It did not feel predatory, but it felt seen. Every time she felt the weight of his attention, a nervous flutter erupted in her stomach. The same man she had been serving coffee to was the man she had just fiercely defended his mother from his intended bride. She kept her head down, her movements efficient. She desperately wanted the 5 days to end. Her rebellion felt less romantic now and more like a catastrophic mistake. She had dreamed of finding purpose. She had not dreamed of becoming the center of a duke's private, terrifying scrutiny. All she wanted was to return to her quiet life, where the stakes were as low as the success of her rose bushes. She avoided the Dowager, terrified of the polite reprimand that would surely come. She knew she had crossed a line, a monumental one, by challenging a lady of the ton while wearing a servant's apron. Yet a fierce, protective pride still glowed within her. She would not take back the words she had used to defend Mrs. Davies. The fear she felt was acute, cold, and inescapable. But beneath it was a flicker of realization. A woman who stands for what is right, even in the shadow of punishment, is never truly lost. This difficult path, she told herself, would ultimately lead her toward a freedom more profound than simply working in her father's garden. Miss Evelyn Ashcombe, furious and humiliated, was not finished. On the final morning, Evelyn cornered Archibald in the breakfast room. Her veneer of elegance was strained, her voice tight with desperation. "Archibald, I must speak to you privately about that woman," Evelyn whispered, gesturing vaguely toward the servants' area, where Margot was stacking linens. "The maid, Kempshot. She is entirely unsuitable, insolent, clearly unbalanced. She attacked me, Archibald. Imagine the scandal if you keep her on staff. She is a disruption, a wild, uncontrolled element you simply cannot have in your house." Archibald listened, his face remaining perfectly neutral. He finally looked at Evelyn, and his eyes were colder than the ice on the mountains he had toured. "Miss Ashcombe," he said, his voice quiet but sharp enough to halt the conversation around them. "I believe I've made myself clear on the matter of that incident." Before Evelyn could sputter a protest, the doors opened, and the Dowager Duchess Eleanor entered the room for the first time since her unmasking. She was impeccable in purple silk, her carriage regal, her face composed. She looked every inch the formidable woman who had run this household for decades. Eleanor walked directly to Archibald, placed a hand on his arm, and then turned her gaze, a gaze that had reduced ministers to apology, onto Evelyn. "Miss Ashcombe," Eleanor said, her voice smooth and carrying, "I believe you are offering your thoughts on the conduct of my staff." Evelyn, confronted by the woman she had publicly shamed, flushed scarlet. She tried to recover. "Dowager Duchess, I was merely advising Archibald that the maid, Kempshott, has a volatile temperament. A woman of that nature brings chaos, and Archibald values his tranquility." Eleanor smiled, a perfectly polite, perfectly lethal smile. "My dear Miss Ashcombe," she stated, her authority absolute, "you are quite mistaken. I've observed the staff closely these past few days. I found Kempshott to be efficient, brave, and exceptionally loyal to those she serves. Furthermore, a woman who is unafraid to speak the truth when witnessing cruelty is precisely the woman my family needs in its orbit. Chaos, Miss Ashcombe, is only ever introduced by people who believe their entitlement excuses their behavior." Eleanor paused, letting the silence crush Evelyn. "Archibald," she continued, turning to her son, "I believe you have no need for further advice regarding the staffing of this house, do you?" "None at all, Mother," Archibald confirmed, an unusual spark of admiration in his eye. Evelyn Ashcombe had lost. She curtsied stiffly and retreated, defeated not by a duke, but by a mother defending the dignity of a girl who had defended her. The fifth and final night ended with a weary sigh. As the morning light touched the Whitstone grounds, Margot packed the single worn portmanteau she had brought. Her final wages, an astonishing sum that felt too heavy in her hand, were tucked safely inside. She sought out Mrs. Halpert, the housekeeper. "I believe I'm finished, madam. I'm taking the early carriage to the station." Mrs. Halpert, who now looked at Margot with profound, knowing respect, stopped her. "My dear, the Dowager Duchess gave strict instructions. A private carriage has been prepared for you. You're to be taken directly home, and the Duke himself wished to—" Margot shook her head firmly. This was the final, important act of her rebellion. "Thank you, but no," Margot said, meeting the housekeeper's eye. "I came here as a servant. I will leave as one. I must." It was her final refusal to be defined by title. A small carriage used for hauling laundry was ready. Margot gave her silent farewell to the back corridors, the kitchen heat, and the quiet dignity of her lie. She climbed in. In the shadows of the morning mist near the stable block, Archibald stood unseen. He watched the small carriage roll away, carrying the only person who had ever truly disturbed him. He stood there long after the sound of the wheels had faded, staring at the empty drive. He had let her go. He had let the most compelling, genuine, and challenging woman he had ever met return to the unknown, without a word, without a promise. But as the mist lifted, a new feeling, a determined, terrifying resolve, took hold of him. He might crave peace, but he was a duke, and a duke did not sit still when his future had just driven away. He was not sure how or when, but he knew one thing with absolute certainty. Margot Kempshott would be back. He would ensure it. Margot walked through the gates of Kempshott, her own home, and felt nothing but hollow dread. The carriage smelled of damp wool and laundry soap, and the weight of the gold in her pocket, her honest earnings, felt heavy, tainted by the memory of the Duke's stunned face. She had spent 5 nights seeking purpose and had left having witnessed a massive, unforgivable scandal. She was afraid her father would learn the truth of her temporary occupation, but mostly she was afraid the Dowager Duchess would send a letter demanding she answer for her insolence. She spent a week in her garden, hands deep in the soil, trying to ground herself. The earth was honest. It did not lie about titles or intentions. She told herself that Whitstone House was a ghost, a fever dream, and that Archibald Whitstone, with his rigid spine and shattering blue eyes, was simply a handsome mistake. Then the footman arrived. He wore the black and white livery of Whitstone. He held a thick, creamy envelope sealed with the ducal crest. Margot's breath hitched, the panic instant and sharp. Here it comes. The consequence. The demand for silence or perhaps a polite threat of ruin. She snatched the letter and retreated to the library, her heart hammering against her ribs. She broke the seal with a trembling finger. "My dearest Miss Kempshott, I trust you have settled back into your home. The house feels strangely quiet without your quiet competence. I find I cannot shake the memory of your kindness, your fire, and the courage you showed while wearing an apron. I am not writing to scold you, my dear. I am writing to thank you. I wish to invite you to join me for tea and discourse at Whitstone House this coming Friday at 3 o'clock. I should be honored to speak with the woman who defended me when I was most vulnerable. Please do not wear a servant's dress. I know precisely who you are now, Margot. Sincerely and with much affection, Eleanor, Dowager Duchess of Whitstone." Margot stared at the signature. Affection? She wasn't being chastised, she was being summoned. She had helped a duchess while disguised as a maid, and now the duchess was inviting her to tea. This was worse than a threat. This was a direct, terrifying entanglement. She was exposed. She wanted to burn the letter. She wanted to pretend she never received it. Yet the memory of Mrs. Davies, awkward, kind, and humiliated, pulled at her. That woman deserved a friend, even if that friend meant defying her own terror. She accepted. On Friday, she dressed in her finest muslin, a simple lavender walking dress that felt far too plain for the opulent ballroom she had recently scrubbed. Her father, confused but pleased that a dowager duchess sought his spinster daughter's company, sent her off in the Earl's own carriage. The Dowager Duchess Eleanor received her not in the formal, echoing drawing room, but in a small, sunlit private salon overlooking the rolling gardens. It was warm, intimate, and smelled of lemon verbena. Eleanor, wearing a soft grey gown that muted her grandeur, was waiting alone. She rose instantly and crossed the room, taking Margot's hands in hers, a gesture not of a duchess to a daughter of an earl, but of one woman to another. "Margot," Eleanor said, her voice rich with genuine warmth. "You are here. I confess, I was worried you might refuse." "Your Grace," Margot murmured, curtsying deeply, her nervousness making her feel clumsy. I felt I owed you an apology." "Nonsense," Eleanor interrupted, waving a delicate hand. "You owe me nothing but your presence. If anyone owes an apology, it is the Dowager Duchess who forced a girl of your fine spirit to kneel on a stone floor. Please sit." Margot sat, feeling the tension drain out of her shoulders, replaced by a strange, quiet comfort. Eleanor was not the rigid matron of society. She was maternal, perceptive, and utterly disarming. They spoke of the gardens, the failure of last year's roses, the comfort of good tea. It was a genuine conversation, a continuation of the bond forged over a damp rag in the servants' passage. "You are wasted in this town," Eleanor observed, leaning forward. "You possess a keen mind, Miss Kempshott, and a fierce heart." Margot blushed. "I only sought to be useful, Your Grace." "Usefulness is a virtue," Eleanor agreed, her blue eyes thoughtful, "but it must be applied correctly." She leaned back, her smile turning subtly strategic. The tea was suddenly over, and the true purpose of the invitation began. "I confess, my recent deception was for my son's benefit. Archibald is a study in control. He is good, handsome, and capable, but he is desperately afraid of emotion. He needs a disturbance, Margot. He needs a woman who challenges his quiet life." Eleanor sipped her tea, her gaze never leaving Margot's. "And this brings me to my mission, dear girl. You observed my son during the ball. Tell me, honestly, what do you think of Archibald?" The question hit Margot like a physical shock. Her breath caught. What did she think of Archibald? She thought he was infuriatingly handsome, utterly blind, and possessed a devastating vulnerability she had only glimpsed in the moment of his mother's shame. She thought he was the kind of man who would terrify her and yet make her feel profoundly safe. "I think, Your Grace," Margot finally managed, choosing her words carefully, "that the Duke is entirely focused on his duty, perhaps to the detriment of his own happiness." Eleanor's smile widened, pleased with the honesty. "Precisely. Now, I should like to know your thoughts on him, because I need a woman who can see past the Duke and see the good man underneath, and I have decided that woman should be his wife." The air in the room thickened, expectant. Margot swallowed, unable to look away from the Dowager's intense, hopeful gaze. At that exact moment, the double doors to the salon opened. Archibald Whitstone strode in, his face set in the usual disciplined lines, a stack of ledgers in his hand. He stopped instantly, his tall frame freezing mid-step. He had been told his mother was receiving a solicitor. Instead, he saw Margot. She was not in a grey apron. She was in lavender, bathed in the soft afternoon light, seated across from his mother, looking entirely, breathtakingly, at ease. The light caught the deep auburn highlights in her hair and her striking light blue eyes. The eyes that had flashed with magnificent fury were wide with shock. The ledger slid from his grasp, hitting the polished floor with a dull, echoing thud. The formal mask of the Duke shattered. For a man who feared disturbance, his mother had just orchestrated the most beautiful, terrifying disruption of all. He felt the impact of her presence like a physical blow, a sudden, searing realization. This was not a mistake. This was deliberate, and he was trapped. The loneliness he had felt watching her leave was an agony he would not endure again. Though he felt lost now, this terrifying entanglement was merely the beginning of a magnificent, consuming clarity. The tension between the three of them, the Duke, the Dowager, and the daughter of the Earl, was thick enough to choke on. The game had truly begun. Margot returned to Whitstone exactly 1 week later. She drove up to the front portico, this time not in a laundry cart, but in her father's carriage, her heart beating a frantic, uneven rhythm against her ribs. She was nervous about the Dowager, but she was terrified of the Duke. She was ushered into the small, sunlit salon where she had taken tea. The room was empty, save for the scent of lemon verbena and a bowl of fresh hyacinths. She waited, her hands folded tightly in her lap. She waited for a quarter of an hour. The silence of the Duke's wing of the house was profound, unnerving. "This is a duchess who insists on punctuality," Margot thought. She would not be late. A sense of unease crept in. Then the door opened and she flinched, expecting the familiar, elegant purple silk. Instead, Archibald Whitstone entered. He was dressed in a dark blue coat and cream breeches, his auburn hair impeccably styled with a deep side part. He stopped short, his usually striking light blue eyes widening slightly in controlled surprise. He was, Margot thought, the most meticulously arranged man she had ever seen. The sight of him brought back the immediate, terrifying memory of his face as he gasped the word, "Mother." "Miss Kempshott," he said, his voice flat, formal. He did not sound pleased. Margot rose instantly, dropping into a deep, precise curtsy. "Your Grace." "I apologize. I was invited by the Dowager Duchess for 3 o'clock. "Yes," Archibald said, moving into the room, retrieving a forgotten leather glove from a side table. He did not look at her. Mother was urgently called away to see her solicitor regarding estate papers. She left her apologies. Margot swallowed. Called away? Eleanor had orchestrated this. The thought made a fierce, defiant laugh bubble up in her throat, quickly stifled. "I see," Margot said, her voice surprisingly steady. "Then I should take my leave." "No," Archibald said, turning to face her fully, his arms crossed over his chest. "You cannot. Mother left strict instructions. You are to wait." "Wait?" "Yes. She insisted I occupy you until her return, It seems you are the only person who can explain the intricacies of the new French embroidery stitches she wishes to commission. The lie was so ridiculous, so transparent, that it hung in the air like a poorly constructed chandelier. Margot had never touched an embroidery stitch in her life. She met his gaze, and his face was impassive, but his eyes were alive with challenge. He hated this, hated being forced into proximity, yet his mother's command held absolute power over his sense of duty. He thinks I am foolish. He thinks I am easily managed. He thinks a lie about embroidery will suffice. She would not allow it. "Your Grace," Margot said, settling back onto the small sofa. "I'm afraid your mother has been misinformed. My skills lie with the earth, not the needle. I could not tell you a French stitch from a German one, and I would be a poor companion if you desire polite chatter about the latest scandals." He blinked. The perfect rigidity of his shoulders lessened by a fraction. "Indeed," he replied, taking a seat opposite her, maintaining a careful distance. "Then what, Miss Kempshott, do you wish to speak of?" "Purpose," Margot said instantly, leaning forward. "Why do you hate the ball so much?" The question was blunt, too raw for the refined setting. Archibald's expression darkened, clearly unused to such a direct emotional demand. "They are disturbances," he said simply. "They are inefficient. They serve no purpose beyond satisfying the superficial desires of the tongue." Margot shook her head. "But they serve a purpose for your mother. They serve the purpose of finding you a wife. And if you value efficiency, then why not engage with the women honestly, instead of hiding behind politeness?" He stared at her, genuinely taken aback. "I cannot engage with them honestly. I am the Duke of Whitstone. Honesty is a liability. Is that why you didn't speak to me when I was a maid?" Margot pressed, suddenly brave, driven by the reckless spirit of her inner rebellion. "Because I was a liability then too. Yet I was the one telling the truth." The air crackled between them. Archibald felt a sudden, profound desire to abandon his careful structure, to defend himself to this woman. He looked at her, at the clarity in her light blue eyes, and realized she was seeing the brittle, fearful man beneath the ducal veneer. No one, not even his mother, had ever stripped him bare like this. "I did not speak to you," he said, his voice rougher now, "because I did not know what to say. You stood up to Miss Ashcombe. You showed more courage and dignity in that plain grey dress than any woman at the ball. You were magnificent, Miss Kempshott, and I was entirely ashamed that I had not seen it sooner." Margot's breath hitched. That raw, brutal honesty, it was the quiet connection she had craved. The Dowager Duchess, who was actually hiding in the adjoining conservatory, tending to her prize ferns, smiled triumphantly. "My son is finally challenged." This is where the work begins. Eleanor waited 10 more minutes, then made her grand, entirely coincidental, re-entry. "Archibald, Miss Kempshott." "Forgive me. The solicitor delayed me dreadfully." She beamed, sensing the static tension in the room. "Margot, you must not leave yet." "Archibald, I have a sudden craving for a walk." "But my joints." "Oh, my joints." "Archibald, you must show Miss Kempshott the new gazebo near the lily pond. I simply cannot manage the steps." Archibald knew he was being manipulated. He knew this was a stage set by his mother, but he found he could not resist the command. "Come, Miss Kempshott," he said, rising and offering his arm with a newfound, almost eager formality. "The gazebo is quite tranquil." They walked the gardens in silence at first. Margot took in the crisp English air, the scent of damp earth and clipped privet hedge. She walked beside the Duke, a Duke she had served tea to, a Duke who had just confessed his shame. "Your mother is a strategist," Margot murmured. "She is a chaos agent," Archibald corrected, a ghost of a smile touching his lips. It was a genuine human moment. As they neared the lily pond, the Duke finally spoke again, his voice dropping low, sharing a genuine thought for the first time. "Why were you working as a maid, Margot?" She looked at him, recognizing the trust in the private question. "Because I needed to know what I was capable of, Your Grace. I needed purpose. I needed to escape the life that had already defined me. He stopped walking, turning to face her near the wrought iron bench. He looked at her with an intensity that took her breath away. "You have defined yourself better than any duchess I have ever met," he said. "Do not let anyone ever tell you differently." In that moment, standing by the green water, Margot knew her heart was lost. She saw the true, honest man beneath the title, the man who was lonely and seeking a connection as real as the touch of the damp soil on his hands. This was not a flirtation. This was an excavation of the heart, and she was already too deep to turn back. Archibald continued to find excuses to visit his mother whenever Margot was scheduled to call. She became the Dowager's unofficial companion, but her true purpose was far more complicated. She was the key that was slowly, patiently unlocking the Duke. Margot had fallen into the most unusual routine. She was now a frequent, expected visitor at Whitstone. Her visits were dedicated to the Dowager Duchess Eleanor, but they were almost always punctuated by an accidental, yet inevitable, encounter with the Duke. She sat with Eleanor, discussing the fate of the country's poor or the merits of various philosophers, only to have Archibald stride in, claiming he needed his mother's opinion on the latest tax report. He would sit, silent and intense, ostensibly reading, but his gaze would drift across the room, watching the way Margot spoke, the way her hand moved when she emphasized a point. He was hungry for her presence. She was the one part of his life he could not plan, the single, chaotic variable that made him feel truly, terrifyingly alive. Margot knew the truth. She was a pawn in the Dowager's strategy, but she was a willing pawn. Being near him, challenging him with her quick wit, watching his rigid walls soften, it was a deep, satisfying purpose she had never found in her own quiet home. The day the rain began, it was a sudden, violent downpour, the sky turning a bruised, heavy purple. Margot was in the greenhouse with Eleanor, looking at the gardener's latest bedding plants which were clustered near the door, waiting to be moved to the safety of the main conservatory. "Oh heavens," Eleanor sighed, clutching her shawl. "They will be ruined. Mr. Davies is not back from the West Wing. We must bring them in." Margot did not hesitate. "I can manage them, Your Grace. They are not heavy." Eleanor, knowing exactly what she was doing, feigned weakness. "My dear, I cannot possibly lift that tray. You are a miracle." Margot smiled, grabbed the first tray of delicate seedlings, and dashed through the deluge toward the main glass doors. She made the trip 3 times, the rain plastering her lavender silk to her skin and soaking the ribbons in her hair. She worked fast, efficient, and determined, feeling the raw, honest exhaustion she had embraced as a maid. On the 4th trip, she slipped on the wet stone near the threshold, catching the tray just before it hit the ground. Archibald, who had been standing in the doorway watching her under the guise of searching for his mother, saw the near fall. He bolted forward. "Margot!" He snatched the tray from her hands. His face, usually so composed, was etched with genuine panic. "Are you mad? You are soaked to the bone. What possessed you to risk yourself for a few flowers?" Margot stood there, shivering, catching her breath. "They were going to freeze, Your Grace. It was necessary." He gripped her arm, his touch firm, possessive. "Necessary? The gardener is paid to manage this, not the Earl's daughter." He dragged her inside, yelling for hot water, blankets, and Mrs. Halpert. Eleanor emerged from the greenhouse, her eyes sparkling with wicked maternal triumph. She had achieved maximum drama and maximum forced proximity. Margot's wet ordeal caught up to her that night. By midnight, she was in the Duke's best guest chamber, delirious and burning with a high fever. The Dowager sat with her, sponging her brow, but she was exhausted. "I must rest, dear girl. I'm old." Archibald took her place without a word. He sat on the velvet chair beside the bed, watching the shallow rise and fall of Margot's chest. Her strong hands were limp on the counterpane. Her face, usually so vibrant and fiercely intelligent, was pale and damp with sweat. This was the true cost of allowing a disturbance into his life. This agonizing fear, this terrible, gut-wrenching realization that something he now needed was fragile, mortal, and entirely outside his control. He looked at her, at the raw vulnerability exposed by her illness, and he knew then that his feeling for her was not just respect or curiosity, but absolute, terrifying love. He gently reached out, touching the back of his hand to her forehead. Her skin was furnace hot. The fear twisted his gut tighter than any corset. He pulled his hand back, shame crashing over him. He was a duke. He could fix treaties, manage thousands of acres, but he could not fix a girl's fever. He was utterly useless. He cleared his throat and began to speak, his voice a low, hesitant murmur in the darkened room. He didn't speak of taxes or propriety. He spoke of the deepest part of himself. "When I was a boy," he whispered, thinking she was asleep, "I found an injured robin in the stable block. I brought it to my mother, terrified it would die. She told me to hold it and tell it a story, because fear needs distraction." He closed his eyes, leaning forward, the rigidity finally gone. He told her a fractured, simple fairy tale of a lonely boy who lived in a massive, quiet castle, who was afraid of the giants of duty and solitude, and who was finally saved by a fierce, small bird who flew into his life and taught him how to sing. He ended the story, his voice cracking. He looked at Margot, beautiful even in her pain, and the confession poured out of him, ragged and uncontrolled, meant only for the shadows. He knew he was giving away his safety. He knew this raw, ugly fear was the price of his new life. "I cannot lose you," he whispered into the silent room, the words tearing from his soul. "Do you hear me, Margot? I cannot bear to lose you." He sat there for hours. The only sign of his fear, the deep crease between his brows and the trembling of his hands. The uncertainty was brutal, the fear of loss acute. But this pain, he sensed, was the honest, necessary fire that would forge his courage. The darkness of this night was simply the prelude to the light they would share. The morning sun that filtered through the heavy velvet curtains of the guest chamber was gray and weak, much like the way Margot felt when she finally opened her eyes. The fever had broken. The fire in her blood had cooled to a damp, shivering exhaustion. She felt hollowed out, scraped clean by the heat that had ravaged her during the night. She tried to shift against the pillows, but her limbs felt as heavy as lead. She was not alone. Archibald was standing by the window, his back to the room. He was still wearing the clothes from the day before. The dark blue coat now wrinkled, his linen shirt unfastened at the throat. He looked nothing like the impeccable Duke of Whitstone. He looked like a man who had stood guard over a battlefield. Margot watched him for a moment, the memory of the night returning in fractured, hazy pieces. The cold rain, the heat, the terrifying sensation of drowning in her own skin, and a voice, low, desperate, and anchoring, telling her a story about a bird. "I cannot lose you," had she dreamed it? It felt too raw, too honest to be a dream. "Your Grace," she whispered. Her voice was a rusted scrap of sound. Archibald turned instantly. The relief that washed over his face was so profound, so unguarded, that Margot felt it like a physical touch. He crossed the room in 2 strides, but stopped short of the bed, his hands clenching at his sides as if he were physically restraining himself from reaching for her. "You are awake," he said, his voice rough with fatigue. "The fever. Mrs. Halpert says it has broken." "I am thirsty," she murmured. He poured water from a crystal carafe, his hands trembling slightly, a tremor that shocked her more than the fever had. He helped her drink, supporting her head with a gentleness that made her chest ache. "I caused this," he said quietly, setting the glass down. He didn't look at her. He looked at the floor, his expression dark with self-loathing. "I watched you in that rain. I let you stay out there because I was too busy playing my mother's game of observation. I should have stopped you the moment you stepped outside." "Archibald," she said, using his name without thinking. "I chose to go out. I'm not a child you failed to mind. No. He looked up, his eyes bleak. You are the woman I failed to protect. Before she could answer, before she could ask him about the story of the bird, the heavy oak door to the bedroom slammed open. The sound was like a gunshot in the quiet room. Mrs. Halpert was fluttering anxiously in the hallway, but she was powerless to stop the man who strode in. It was Earl Kempshott, Margot's father. He was travel-stained, his face flushed with a mixture of terror and fury. Margot! He rushed to the bedside, ignoring the Duke entirely. He looked at his daughter, pale, weak, lying in a strange bed in a strange house, and his fear exploded into anger. What in God's name has happened? The Earl turned on his heel to face Archibald, his voice shaking. I receive a message at dawn that my daughter is gravely ill. I arrived to find her looking like a ghost. Explain yourself, Whitstone. Archibald straightened. The exhausted, vulnerable man vanished, replaced instantly by the rigid posture of the Duke. It was a defense mechanism, Margot realized. He was armoring himself. Miss Kempshott contracted a fever yesterday, Archibald said, his tone cool, though his eyes remained shadowed. The physician was called immediately. She has received the best possible care. A fever. The Earl's eyes darted around the room, taking in the intimacy of the scene, the unmade bed, the Duke's disheveled appearance, the clear evidence that Archibald had spent the night in this room. And why was she here? Why was she not sent home the moment she fell ill? Because it was dangerous to move her, Archibald replied. And where was your mother? The Earl demanded. I see you here, Your Grace, in a state of undress, in a lady's bedchamber. Where is the Dowager Duchess? I am here, Lord Kempshott. Eleanor's voice floated in from the doorway, calm and unruffled. She entered with the grace of a woman who had never been frightened in her life, though Margot noticed the tightness around her eyes. And I assure you, Eleanor continued, moving to stand between the two men, that your daughter's virtue is as intact as her spirit. My son was merely keeping watch while I rested. We nearly lost her last night, Arthur. The Earl deflated slightly at the use of his name, the terror of losing his only daughter overriding his propriety. He turned back to Margot, stroking her hair with a trembling hand. My dear girl, he whispered, you should never have come here. I knew this friendship was too sudden. He looked up at Archibald with a renewed, cold suspicion. What was she doing to contract such a fever? Margot is strong. She does not sicken easily. Margot tried to sit up. Father, please. It was the rain. I was helping with the plants. The plants? The Earl frowned, confused. Why were you tending to the Duke's plants? Does he not have servants? The silence that followed was thick and suffocating. This was the precipice. The truth of the last few weeks. The disguise, the rebellion, the maid's apron, sat heavily in the room. Archibald stepped forward. She was helping, he said, his voice devoid of emotion, because she is generous, and because I did not appreciate the value of her safety enough to stop her. The Earl looked at Archibald, really looked at him, and saw something that made his expression harden. He saw a man who was too invested. He saw a man who looked at his daughter not with polite interest, but with a desperate, consuming hunger. I'm taking her home, the Earl announced abruptly. She is too weak, Archibald said instantly, panic flashing in his eyes. She is my daughter, the Earl snapped, and she is currently the subject of a narrative I do not like. You are a duke, Whitstone. You have a reputation for coldness and calculation. I will not have Margot used as whatever this is. An amusement, a disruption. It is not an amusement, Archibald said, his voice dropping to a dangerous quiet. Then what is it? The Earl challenged. Can you look me in the eye and tell me you have no intentions toward her? Because standing here, in your shirt sleeves, having watched her sleep all night, it looks a great deal like compromise. Archibald froze. The word hung in the air. Compromise. He looked at Margot. She was watching him, her blue eyes wide, waiting. He remembered the feeling of her hand in his. He remembered the story of the bird. He remembered the terrifying, overwhelming love that had brought him to his knees just hours ago. But now, faced with her father, faced with the reality of the danger he had put her in, the old fear rushed back. He had almost killed her with his negligence. He had compromised her reputation. He was a man who brought disturbance, and look what it had done. It had nearly extinguished her light. He was not the bird. He was the giant. He was the danger. He couldn't claim her. Not now. Not when he felt so unworthy. To claim her now, in the face of her father's anger, would be to trap her. He wanted her to choose him, not be forced to him by scandal. "I have the utmost respect for your daughter," Archibald said finally, the words tasting like ash. "I would never do anything to damage her standing." It was the right thing to say socially. It was the wrong thing to say emotionally. Margot felt the distance open up between them like a canyon. He was retreating. He was putting the armor back on, plate by plate. The Earl nodded, satisfied by the capitulation, but still angry. "Then have your carriage brought around. We leave within the hour. I will wrap her in blankets myself." "Father," Margot protested weakly, "I can stay until—" "No," Archibald cut in. He didn't look at her. He couldn't. "Your father is right. You should be at home. You will be safer there." The rejection was soft, but it cut deeper than the cold rain. He turned to his mother. "I will be in my study. Please ensure Lord Kempshott has whatever he requires." Archibald walked out of the room without looking back. He walked with a perfect, rigid stride, the stride of a duke who was in complete control, while inside he felt his heart quietly shattering into dust. Margot watched the empty doorway. The fever was gone, but a new, colder ache had settled in her chest. He had saved her in the dark, whispered promises to the shadows, but in the light of day, he had let her go. Eleanor watched her son leave, her expression unreadable. She moved to the window, watching the rain clouds clearing over the estate. "He thinks he is saving you," Eleanor murmured, almost to herself. "The foolish boy. He thinks he is the villain of this story." She turned to Margot, her eyes fierce. "Do not believe his silence, Margot. Fear makes men deaf, even to their own hearts. He let you go because he loves you too much to risk being the reason you are hurt again." Margot closed her eyes, fighting back tears of weakness and frustration. "He didn't fight for me." "No," Eleanor agreed softly. "Not yet. He has to forgive himself first. And that, my dear, is a battle he must fight alone." The Earl bustled about, calling for maids and warm cloaks, oblivious to the fact that the real tragedy wasn't the fever, but the silence the Duke had left behind. As Margot was carried out to the carriage an hour later, wrapped in wool and misery, she looked up at the great stone facade of Whitstone House. A figure stood at the window of the library, a shadow against the glass. He was watching. He was always watching. But watching, Margot thought bitterly as the carriage jolted forward, is not the same as loving. The distance grew. The house faded, and Archibald Whitstone remained behind, imprisoned once again in his perfect, peaceful, empty life. The silence in Whitstone House was absolute. It was the kind of silence Archibald had spent 10 years curating, the kind he had claimed was his greatest treasure. Now it felt like a tomb. 3 days had passed since Earl Kempshott had taken his daughter away. 3 days of order, 3 days of undisturbed meals, perfectly folded newspapers, and a schedule that ran with the precision of a Swiss clock. Archibald sat in his study, the leather chair cool against his back. He stared at the ledger in front of him, but the numbers blurred into grey nothingness. He was safe. He had done the honorable thing. He had let her go to protect her from the chaos of his life, from the negligence he had shown in the rain. He told himself this was victory. He told himself he was relieved. But the heart is a stubborn, treacherous thing. It does not care for logic, and it certainly does not care for honor. It only knows that the room is empty, and the light is gone. He did not know it then, sitting in the gloom of his study, but this misery was not an ending. It was simply the necessary darkness before the dawn. A man must feel the cold completely before he can truly understand the warmth of the fire. The door clicked open. He didn't look up. "I'm not receiving visitors, Mother." "I'm not a visitor," Eleanor replied, her voice sharp. "I'm the woman who gave you life, and I'm currently watching you waste it." She walked into the room, not with her usual grace, but with a stomping impatience. She pulled the curtains open. The afternoon light assaulted the room, hitting the dust motes dancing in the air. Archibald flinched. "Close them?" he said wearily. "No," Eleanor snapped. She stood before his desk, looking down at him. She didn't look like a duchess. She looked like a mother who had run out of patience. "I've watched you pace this floor for 3 days. You look like a ghost, Archibald. A ghost haunting his own life." "I'm respecting her father's wishes," Archibald said, his voice tight. "I'm leaving her be. I nearly killed her with my carelessness. The least I can do is give her peace." "Peace?" Eleanor laughed, a dry, humorless sound. "Is that what you call this? This vacuum? You're not giving her peace. You're giving her silence. You are confirming her worst fear, that she was merely a temporary amusement for a bored duke." Archibald slammed his hand on the desk, the sound echoing like a gunshot. "She was never an amusement. She is everything." The confession hung in the air, vibrating. Eleanor's expression softened instantly. She leaned forward, her hands bracing on the mahogany. "Then why are you here?" she whispered. "Why are you here, surrounded by books and dead numbers, when the woman who woke you up is miles away, thinking she meant nothing to you?" "Because I am dangerous to her," Archibald said, his voice cracking. "I treated her like a servant. I let her walk home in the dark. I let her stand in the rain until she burned with fever. I'm not the hero of this story, Mother. I'm the villain." Eleanor reached out, tilting his chin up so he had to look at her. "You're only the villain if you stay in this chair," she said firmly. "You found contentment in shadows, my son. It was safe, it was easy. But love is not safe, and it is certainly not easy. You found contentment in shadows. Now step into the light." Archibald stared at her. The fear was still there. The paralyzing fear of doing the wrong thing, of being rejected. But beneath the fear, the ache in his chest was becoming unbearable. He realized he would rather be rejected by Margot Kempshott than live another hour in this perfect, terrible silence. He stood up. The chair scraped loudly against the floor. "Get my horse," he said. The ride to the Kempshott estate was a blur of wind and adrenaline. When he arrived, he didn't go to the front door. He didn't ask for the Earl. He went to the garden. He knew she would be there. He knew it with the same instinct that told him the sun would rise. And she was. She was kneeling by a bed of late-blooming roses, her hands gloved, a straw hat shading her pale face. She looked thinner. The fever had taken something from her, but the set of her shoulders was as defiant as ever. Archibald stopped at the edge of the path. His heart hammered against his ribs, a frantic, terrified rhythm. "Margot." She froze. She didn't turn immediately. She finished pruning a stem, placed it in her basket, and then, slowly, she stood. She turned to face him. Her blue eyes were clear, guarded, and heartbreakingly distant. "Your Grace," she said. "No, Archibald, just the title. A wall of ice." Archibald stepped forward, then stopped. All the speeches he had rehearsed on the ride over vanished. He felt stripped bare. "I did not come to offer excuses." "Good," Margot said softly, "because I do not wish to hear them." "I came to tell you that I was wrong," he said. The words rushed out now. "I was wrong to let you leave. I was wrong to hide in my library while your father took you away. I was afraid." "Afraid of what?" Margot asked, tilting her head. "Of my father. Of scandal." "Afraid of myself," he confessed. He took a step closer, ignoring the impropriety. "I treated you as a servant because it was easier than admitting I saw you as an equal. I let you return home alone because I was terrified that if I asked you to stay, I would never let you leave. And I doubted you. I doubted us. Because I did not believe I deserved a woman who burns as brightly as you do." Margot watched him, her breath hitching slightly. This was not the Duke. This was the man who had whispered in the dark. "You hurt me," she said honestly. Her voice trembled. "You let me believe I was just a disruption to be managed." "You are a disruption," Archibald said, his voice dropping to a harsh whisper. "You are the most violent, beautiful disruption I have ever known. You shattered my peace, Margot, and I thank God for it every day, because before you, I wasn't living, I was just existing." He reached out, his hand hovering near hers, asking for permission. "I admire your mind," he said, his eyes searching hers. "I admire your courage. I admire the way you defended my mother when you had everything to lose. I do not want peace anymore, Margot. I want you." Margot looked at his hand, then up at his face. She saw the fear in his eyes, the raw, naked terror of losing her. She softened. The ice around her heart began to crack, melted by the heat of his sincerity, but she did not take his hand. Not yet. She stepped back just an inch. "You speak beautifully, Archibald," she said quietly. "And I believe you are sorry. But guilt is a powerful motivator, and I will not be a wife taken out of guilt or obligation or pity for a fever I chose to risk." "It is not guilt," he swore. "Then prove it," she whispered. "Do not ask me for an answer today. Do not ask me because you feel bad about the rain. Ask me when the sun is shining and you are sure, truly sure, that you can live with a wife who will never, ever let you hide in the shadows again." She turned and walked back toward her roses, leaving him standing on the path. Archibald watched her go. He didn't chase her. He didn't argue. He stood there, and for the first time in his life, he smiled without knowing it. He hadn't won her yet, but she hadn't told him to leave. She had told him to prove it. And he would. If it took a lifetime, he would prove it. The fear was gone, replaced by a singular, blinding purpose. The happily ever after wasn't here yet, but he could feel it, waiting just beyond the horizon, warm and inevitable as the summer sun. Archibald waited 3 days. He did not wait out of fear, but out of a need for absolute propriety. He watched the heavens, waiting for the heavy gray clouds to vanish completely. He required the world to be bright. He would offer her no shadows. On the 4th morning, the sun broke over the horizon, a blinding, glorious gold that burned the mist off the hills. Archibald descended the front steps of Whitstone House, pulling on his gloves. His horse was ready. But so was the ducal carriage, its crest gleaming in the light. Standing by the open carriage door, wrapped in a velvet travel cloak and looking entirely formidable, was the Dowager Duchess Eleanor. "Mother," Archibald paused, "I intend to ride to Kempshott." "I am well aware," Eleanor said, stepping into the carriage with a small, determined smile. "And you are going to the garden to press your suit. But someone must speak to her father. The Earl remains aggrieved, Archibald. If you wish to secure the daughter, you require me to placate the father. You must attend to your heart. I shall attend to the diplomacy." Archibald let out a breath, a genuine smile touching his lips. "I am in your debt, Mother." He mounted his horse, and together, Duke and Dowager, they rode toward their future. When they arrived at Kempshott, the Dowager's carriage proceeded to the main entrance to occupy the Earl, while Archibald rode straight to the east garden. He walked through the iron gate, his boots soaking in the heavy dew, his heart beating with a rhythm that was no longer frantic, but steady and sure. Margot was there. Of course she was. She was deadheading the hydrangeas, the very image of the quiet purpose she had sought. She heard his footsteps on the gravel. She paused, her back to him. She didn't turn around, but her shoulders tensed. "The sun has returned, Miss Kempshott," he said. His voice was clear in the morning air. She turned slowly. She looked at him, really looked at him. He was not wearing his stiff ducal coat. He was in his shirt sleeves, his hair slightly wind-blown, his face open and vulnerable in the sharp light. "It has, Your Grace," she whispered. Archibald walked up to her. He didn't stop until he was close enough to see the gold flecks in her blue eyes. "You told me to ask you when I was certain," he said. "I've been certain since the moment you stood in a hallway in a grey apron and told a lady that cruelty was a choice. I was merely too blind to name the feeling." He did not care about the damp grass. He did not care about the mud. Archibald Whitstone, the Duke who had worshipped order above all else, dropped to his knees in the dirt. Margot gasped, her hands flying to her mouth. "Archibald, I no longer desire mere tranquility," he said, looking up at her, his soul in his eyes. "I have found that silence is hollow. I desire the storm. I desire the spirited debates. I desire the garden and the beautiful disorder of a life shared with you. I wish to be disturbed, Margot, every single day until I draw my last breath." He reached into his pocket. He did not withdraw a massive diamond. He produced a small, simple ring, an emerald, deep and green as the moss in the woods where she liked to walk. "You are the daughter of an earl," he said softly. "But my heart belongs to the woman who scrubbed floors to find her own worth. So I am asking the woman who is both. Margot, will you save me from the quiet? Will you do me the honor of becoming my wife?" Margot looked down at him. She saw the fear he had once confessed to, but she saw it conquered by a love that was terrifyingly vast. She dropped to her knees in the wet grass beside him, ignoring the stain on her muslin dress, meeting him on his own ground. "Yes," she whispered, tears spilling over. "Yes, Archibald, I will disturb you for the rest of your life." He kissed her then. Not a polite, cold peck of the aristocracy, but a kiss that tasted of relief and sunlight and a promise kept. High above, on the stone terrace of the house, the Earl of Kempshott stood with a cup of tea in his hand, looking down at the couple in the grass. Beside him stood the Dowager Duchess Eleanor, who had successfully charmed him into silence. She lowered her spyglass, a single tear tracking through the powder on her cheek. "At last," she breathed. The epilogue. 5 years later. The gardens of Whitstone House had never looked wilder or more beautiful. There were roses climbing the statues where they ought not to be. There were wooden toys abandoned on the pristine gravel paths. There was noise, laughter, shouting, the bark of a dog, echoing off the stone walls that had once held only silence. Archibald sat on a stone bench, a small, dark-haired girl of 4 asleep on his lap. He was holding a report on a state crop rotation, but his eyes were not on the paper. They were across the lawn, watching Margot chase a toddling boy through the lilies. She was laughing, her hair coming loose from its pins, looking radiant and entirely untamed. Archibald felt that familiar swell in his chest, the ache of gratitude that never quite abated. The glass doors opened, and the Dowager Duchess walked out. She moved slower now, leaning on a cane, but her eyes were as sharp as ever. She sat beside him, watching the joyful chaos. "You look fatigued, Archibald," she noted, though her tone was satisfied. "I'm exhausted," he admitted, smiling down at his sleeping daughter. "It is magnificent." Eleanor hummed, watching Margot scoop up their son and spin him around. "You know," Eleanor said softly, "society whispered that I was mad, dressing as a maid, scrubbing floors at my age. They said it was a foolish scheme." "It was," Archibald agreed, leaning his head against his mother's shoulder. "Thank you." Eleanor patted his hand, her gaze fixing on Margot, the woman who had defended her dignity when she had none, the woman who had saved her son from a life of cold perfection. "I set out to find a wife for my son," Eleanor whispered, the final satisfaction settling in her heart. "But in the end, I believe I found a daughter for myself." And in the golden light of the afternoon, amidst the beautiful disturbance of a life fully lived, everything was exactly as it should be.